Now, it's not exactly a phenomena that is only happening in the Uglies fandom, that there are many people who write down or speak the most bizarre takes that are not supported anywhere in the text and maybe even try to monetize these. But if you are, like me, a fan of the book series even before the movie came out, or even just liked the movie and thought longer about this, you likely already noticed the sheer amount of this type of takes. And it was just so strange to me that this would happen this extremely in this specific fandom, but not as much in the other fandoms I'm in. And I am in quite a few quite toxic fandoms. My last straw before I finally sat down and wrote this was seeing a certain big YouTuber I don't want to name because I don't want to be harassed claim that Uglies is anti-feminist because criticizing beauty culture is oppressive to feminine women. Which is not just such a bizarre interpretation of feminism, but also a misunderstanding of the actual messages of the book and the movie. Not that the movie doesn't have flaws, I talked about them on my blog, and I'm not talking about people just not vibing with the series or don't liking it because of flaws that are actually there. I'm talking about takes that make you go, did we watch/read the same thing? Where the hell did you even get that from? Also, why am I writing this analysis instead of debunking these takes? And also, why are the comments moderated? Well, have you ever tried to convince someone on the internet that something you knew was true and had proof for it? Then you know that it's impossible and a waste of energy and time. And I would just rather spend this time drawing or writing Tally/Shay. Thank you. The background footage is me colorizing a drawing that is an extension to this very short one-sided fight scene between Tally and Dr. Cable in the last book, which fits well because Tally and Dr. Cable are the characters I see the most media illiterate takes to. The biggest contributor is that people desperately want to hate it. And this has in most places nothing to do with any actual flaws of the movie. You can see that in how the hate already started, as nothing was known about the movie yet other than that there would be a movie. This leads to people choosing the least flattering interpretation for something if there are several, and also just not engaging deeper with it. The biggest explanation for this is misogyny. The YA dystopia was established as sci-fi for teen girls, so it can only be cringe, shallow, and stupid, right? This is particularly visible on Twitter with the most obvious misogynist language, but you can see that even on other sites in the sentiments that glow through the corners of the text. You know, like when you read a text and it doesn't have a specific political view in the words themselves, but you can feel that it was meant in a certain way. This is what I mean. And you can see this misogyny especially well with Joey King. Now, the argument mostly used to justify this is that she's a Zionist, but while she did say some things at the beginning of the war she definitely shouldn't have said, she also realized that this was wrong and tried to damage control. Now, I am not saying that there aren't some people attacking her and making the ever same joke about how she's so fitting for Uglies because it's so funny to say a woman is ugly who do care about Palestine, but most of the time the kind of people who use that as a justification don't even have anything on their profile that in any way actually tries to help or even just inform about Palestine, and I think it's pretty disgusting to use the suffering of Palestinian civilians to shit on an actress you personally don't like. The other main reason, and I don't know how to say this without sounding arrogant, but people don't really seem to comprehend that YA dystopia is a genre. They only see Hunger Games as the original and so the only valid, and everything else as plagiarism. So it has to be bad, and tearing it down is moral obligation. You can see that in how people call Uglies a Hunger Games copycat, even if Uglies the book came out in 2005, before Hunger Games, and a future that is very obviously horrible, full of poverty, in which teens are forced to fight to the death, is quite different than a, on first glance, utopian future without poverty or war, in which everybody at 16 gets an operation without any visible cost to them, which only reveals itself to be horrible if you dig deeper. Yes, they both have teenage girls fighting a regime, but that's just genre similarities that is not being a copy. Uglies, coming out in 2005, was one of the very first YA dystopias ever, only predated by The Giver by Lewis Laurie and Shadow Children by Margaret Haddix, and so, despite never becoming quite as popular as Hunger Games, established the tropes the genre would use in its boom in the 2010s. This means that in 2005, these tropes were new and groundbreaking. However, since Uglies, due to a mix of being incredibly difficult to adapt, being not as mainstream, and just coming too early, was only adapted after the genre's boom, these same tropes now read as cliché and overdone. I think it would have been a good idea to change details from the book for the movie to make it as groundbreaking as the book was, and in my opinion a good way to do this would have either been to make the homoerotic undertones between Tally and Shay a canon romance, or to tell the story non-chronological from Tally, Shay's and Dr. Cable's view. But also it is unfair that the story needs to change just because it was adopted later. We don't expect stories from other genres to do that. But also, since it's from around 5 years before the genre's main popularity, the way these tropes are used does differ from how they were used in later YA dystopias. Not enough to not feel the same, but enough to subvert expectations, to be frustrating. It's from a different time, but if you don't know that, you expect it to be exactly like the 2010 YA dystopias and are disappointed. Tally isn't a typical 2010s YA dystopia main character, but she's just similar enough to look like one in the surface and then to be a disappointment when she doesn't fulfill this role. She's an anti-hero, not to the degree as adult dystopia protagonists like Guy Montag or Winston Smith, but also definitely not as heroic as Katniss Everdeen or Tris Breyer. She deeply believes into the system for most of the book/movie, is quite naive, quite self-focused, and only close to the end gains any understanding how the world actually works. The character who is rebellious from the beginning, smart and brave, is Shay, her best friend, and Shay drives the narrative, not Tally. Her flaws make her feel very human, but also aren't relatable to everybody, but specific consequences of the society she grew up in. They toned that down in the movie, presumably because Tally being unlikable was one of the most common complaints about the books. All of the characters, but especially Tally and Dr. Cable, are deeply formed by their environment. Their moral compass and priorities do not fully align with ours because they come from a society that values different things. Scott Westerfeld does this in all of his works, and I love it. However, that seems to be another hard to grasp thing, that being taught differently and growing up differently, of course you think differently. I saw so many people complain about Tally being vain for panicking this much about being blackmailed with not getting the operation. And in our society, not getting beauty surgery isn't exactly a problem. But in this society, this is a huge part of the normal life trajectory and a huge part of their moral, and not getting it is a social death sentence. Now, it is frustrating to me because she's one of my favorite villains ever, but just from watching the movie, I can understand where this comes from. Dr. Cable isn't exactly like the cliché, suspicious, middle-aged woman ruler trope that the later YA dystopias used so often, and she isn't monodimensional either. But like Tally, she is close enough to this cliché that you wouldn't notice that she's different without deliberately paying attention. That most of her depth comes comes from the third book, where Tally is on her side for most of the story, and that denying her own humanity to appear as just this monstrous, powerful figure is part of her strategy only plays into that. There are small cracks showing her as a private person, but none of this was in the movie. Her sadistic humor as she makes sure that Tally only receives speckle as provisions for her travel, or complaining about the silly architecture in New Pretty Town. Her methods are horrible, but she very much has a noble goal. And one of the scariest parts for me is that this world does feel better than our world, even if I know that it comes at a price. And Dr. Cable believes chipping away her own humanity and doing all these horrible things to, from her view, protect humanity is morally right. It is all there, but it's subtle. And it's also not made better by the movie genuinely flattening some of the nuance of the book. The biggest disadvantage this series has, in my opinion, is that you actively have to run to dig deeper to fully understand it. For most books and movies, if you understand the surface of it, you understand at least most of it. This is the way most people seem to engage with media. As I read Uglies for the first time, I remember that I wasn't particularly impressed by it. I thought it was superficial and a bit too preachy. Only as I continued thinking about it, I understood details about the world and the characters, and suddenly I realized that it did have depth and smart commentary, and that I wanted to read it again. It fits to this world that is specifically designed to be surface level, with citizens conditioned to not think deeper, that the book would seem superficial and shallow at first and only later reveal its depth. The easiest example for that are the place names, Uglyville, New Pretty Town, and so on, which many people complained are way too silly. However, if you remember that the vast majority of people in this society are altered to be easygoing and unimaginative and shallow, it makes sense that their place names would be surface level, obvious, and silly too. I love it, but it does not work well with bigger audiences, especially now that, modeling the point, the movie genuinely does have some moments where the world building was dumbed down. For the most parts, however, it is still like the books in that regard. Interestingly, the part of the message that is on the surface is quite blatant, making it easy to have a wrong sense of security about how deep it really goes. As it's often pointed out, Uglies isn't exactly realistic, and it does not work as a gritty story about how to overthrow an oppressive government. Right now, our society values gritty and realistic stories very high, so it makes sense to measure stories after that. But Uglies isn't meant to work this way. It's an allegory. Not in the way a Greek fable is, but in the way The Time Machine or Brave New World is. Speaking of not being dark and gritty, the tone. Not just is the narrative style relatively easy and almost naive because it's from Tally's view and she is a sheltered teenage girl, there is also a certain optimistic note to the entire story, which can easily be interpreted as being dumb or childish. The next one is something that is particularly frustrating for me. Uglies is not exclusively about beauty culture. It is most certainly not about needing to treat objectively ugly people better or that plastic surgery is bad. It is about how beauty culture can be used to enforce conformity and so control a population. Now, I am torn about complaining about the cast being too conventionally attractive. I hate that they erased that Tally is chubby in the book, and that none of them have the pimply skin real teenagers would have. Especially the chubbiness is something that is so rare to see in movies and in female heroes, and is also the main axis of how beauty culture oppresses people. But it is quite convenient to blame the story and the actors for that, instead of the real life systems of power that are to blame for this, isn't it? And as much as the story would have been more striking had Tally looked like in the book, the message is not exclusively about not conventionally attractive people. Beauty culture harms them much more, but in the end it harms and controls everybody. The overall series is even lesser just about plastic surgery or being ugly. Uglies, the book, is the only part that is even mostly about beauty culture. The other two books are much more about conformity, how it harms harms people, how it's used to control, and the neurodivergent aspect of this enforced conformity. This is overall handled quite well. The way Tally and Shay fight against their own brains, Tally's choice at the end, and helped me so much in accepting myself. But I have to admit that the self-harm and eating disorder part of it is indeed not exactly good. Kind of related to that, I saw some people say that Uglies plays into the not like other girls trope, and this is something I hate about the way not like other girls is talked about in the mainstream generally, and going deeper into that would make the video too long, but the thing is, there are indeed girls who are not like the majority of other girls. Disabled girls like me, queer girls like me, girls of color, and them feeling like them being not like other girls is not saying that they think they are better than everybody else. That is that they feel that they are worse than everybody else and that they would like to be like everybody else. And Tally fits right into this. Her main arc during the entire series is that she feels wrong for how she is and that she wants to fit in and finally accepting that she's different. And a girl who is genuinely different, accepting that she is different instead of hating herself, is not anti-feminist or putting other girls down. What is kind of weird about this point, however, is that I even saw some people who, from their marginalized identities, should be able to understand this point, say these things. And thinking about it, I think that's caused because Tally isn't written as showing the real-life experience of a specific group of marginalized girls. She is canonically neurodivergent. She feels kind of bisexual in her relationship to Shay, and before the movie came out, a large part of the fandom also headcanoned her as being black. But her experience is not something that would happen in real life, but more like how it feels to be different and noticing that you are different no matter how hard you try to fit in. And yeah, marginalized women and girls are not a monolith, but I think this contributes to how even some of them don't notice this allegory. Not understanding genre conventions also definitely plays into the large amount of misinterpretation. I saw someone complaining that it's too easy to tell who is the villain and who is the good guys. Not only does this get much more blurred in the later books, this is also an odd expectation for a YA science fiction book. They're for younger readers, so they are always a bit more black and white than the books intended for older audiences. And it is unfair to hold them to the same standards you would hold a movie or a book for adults. In the same line, there's only so nuanced a book or movie for teens can get. Now, Uglies is definitely much deeper than most of these people noticed, but it's indeed not like a Ursula K. Le Guin book. It's baby's first feminism, and it's intended to be that. It needs to be this way because teens first learn about these topics, so they either know nothing about them or at least not as much as adults would. I remember that while I did know a few very basic things about feminism, this was my introduction to think deeper about this, and this was definitely the very first book I ever read that didn't painted neurodivergent people as just being wrong and needing to be fixed. Maybe this isn't even a question of depth as much as a question of at which point of knowledge the social criticism starts. It does not play into this culture that everything needs to be a twist and unpredictable, not just because of the tropes that were new as it came out but are now very well known, though this certainly takes a huge part in this, but also from the way the character arcs and plot is written. The tension does not come from wondering what Tally will do, but knowing that she will realize that this society is oppressive at some point, but watching how she gets there. Genre fiction does not always have to start with huge stakes. It can start slowly with everyday life in this futuristic world and then escalate from there. That doesn't mean it's boring. However, if you expected it to start with a life or death situation, of course it will feel boring. I also noticed that Uglies is not universally relatable, but very specific, especially the books. But unlike something like Locked Thumb or An Unkindness of Ghosts, it doesn't look like that on first glance, so it doesn't really have an excuse to to be like that, and you just assume bad storytelling when you don't resonate with it. As the hate dome says, it was never as popular as Hunger Games, but back in 2005, as it came out, it was quite well received. There was quite the active fandom on Scott Westerfeld's own forum and also early Tumblr, and I heard from librarians that the books are still well lent out. There's also the fans like me who stuck around for nearly 20 years because they liked these stories and characters so much. In the movie, despite barely any advertising and some of the advertising, the divergent-looking movie poster seeming so bad that it can only be intended to harm the movie, at least I think that, because if it's your job to do advertising, you should be capable of understanding that a poster that looks like Divergent wouldn't work and also doesn't describe the story particularly well. But even despite this, the movie managed to be top 1 on Netflix for a month worldwide. It's not actually a bad story, but there is a clear shift to now. I don't even think it's just media literacy becoming worse in this time, even if this definitely happened, as anyone who is in fandom for more than 10 years at this point can tell. But it's much more a shift in what kind of tropes and narrative styles and character arcs people are able to understand and which ones not. It's an unfortunate conglomerate of narrative choices that are not bad writing per se, but certainly don't work well with most of today's audience anymore. And it's incredibly infuriating to see these reactions unfold.